Imagine a warship so advanced it was meant to crown Sweden as the new naval superpower, armed with 64 bronze guns and towering decks never before seen in the Baltic. Yet within minutes of its maiden voyage, it vanished beneath the waves in full view of a stunned nation. The sinking of Vasa was not just a disaster, it was a collapse of royal ambition and state power, sparking decades of blame, cover-ups, and a haunting question. How could a flagship designed to rule the seas fail so catastrophically, and what did Sweden do next to ensure it never happened again? That answer starts with the urgent ambitions and devastating miscalculations behind Vasa's creation. Baltic waters in the early 1600s were a chessboard of ambition and rivalry. Sweden, boxed in by powerful neighbors and locked in wars from the Gulf of Finland to the Polish coast, watched as its fleet suffered blow after blow. Ships like Tigern were captured, Solon was scuttled, Christina was wrecked, and Riksnikollen ran aground, all within a few years. Each loss threatened Sweden's fragile hold on trade routes and its claim to regional influence. The Polish-Swedish War raged on, and the broader fires of the 30 Years' War pushed every kingdom to outbuild, outgun, and outmaneuver its rivals at sea. For King Gustav II, Adolf, naval supremacy was not just strategy, it was survival. His letters from the front lines demanded action, a new flagship bigger and more fearsome than anything afloat. The king's vision stretched beyond mere defense. He wanted a symbol that would tower over enemy fleets, a floating fortress to break blockades and intimidate rivals. The Navy's leadership, under pressure from both the throne and the tides of war, scrambled to answer. Orders for new ships landed at Stockholm's shipyard. Contracts drafted for vessels larger and more ornate than any built before. The Vasa would not only carry guns, it would carry the hopes of a nation desperate to project power across the Baltic. In this climate, every delay or compromise carried consequences. Prestige and deterrence were as vital as firepower. The rush to launch a new flagship was fueled by fear of falling behind and by the king's personal drive to see Swedish banners rise above the rest. The Vasa began as a response to crisis, but soon became an emblem, one that had to impress allies, frighten enemies, and deliver a clear message. Sweden would not be outdone. Vasa's hull stretched nearly 70 meters from beakhead to stern, making it one of the largest warships of its day. At the widest point, the beam measured 11.7 meters, narrow by the standards of other two-decker ships. The ship's sides rose steeply, crowned by a towering stern castle that soared over 20 meters above the water, loaded with intricate carvings and ornamentation. Below decks, the hull's cross-section was shallow, with little extra width to counterbalance the weight carried above. The planned armament was ambitious. 64 bronze cannons, most of them 24-pounders, distributed across 2 continuous gun decks. Each gun, including its carriage, weighed up to 2.5 tons. The lower battery alone was designed to deliver a broadside that rivaled any ship in the Baltic. Above the main guns sat lighter artillery and a forest of rigging, masts, and sails. 10 masts in total, with a sail area that could drive the ship at speed in open water. Ballast presented a different challenge. Only about 120 tons of stone and iron were packed low in the hold, squeezed between the keel timbers. This was less than half the amount needed to match the weight piled high above. The lower gun ports, cut just a meter above the waterline, left little margin for adding more ballast without sacrificing freeboard. Every element, guns, ballast, hull, and superstructure, was locked in a delicate balance, with little room for error. The result was a ship that looked every inch a floating fortress, but whose mass and proportions would soon reveal a hidden flaw. As construction advanced in Stockholm's Navy Yard, the Vasa's design began to shift under the weight of royal demands. The original plans called for a single gun deck, but orders from the king soon required a second, doubling the number of heavy bronze cannons mounted high above the waterline. Each new directive added more mass to the upper works, from the ornate stern castle to hundreds of carved figures, lions, biblical kings, and sea monsters, all meant to project Sweden's power. These decorations, crafted from dense oak and pine, crowded the ship's galleries and railings, raising the center of gravity with every plank and sculpture. Yet the hull itself changed very little. Shipwrights widened the beam only slightly, unable to reshape the structure once the keel and frames were set. The result was a narrow body now forced to carry unprecedented weight aloft, with no matching increase in ballast or underwater volume. Every additional gun and carving locked the imbalance deeper into the ship's bones. By the time the Vasa neared completion, instability was no longer a distant risk. It was built into the very fabric of the vessel, waiting for the moment it would matter most. On a quiet August morning in 1628, a final check played out beside Stockholm's royal palace. 30 sailors lined up on Vasa's upper deck, ordered to run from one rail to the other, then back again. With every dash, the ship rocked sharply, rolling so far that the deck sloped beneath their feet. After just 3 crossings, the officers watching from the quay called an abrupt halt. The ship had heeled so dangerously that even seasoned seamen hesitated, fearing she might capsize right there at her moorings. Admiral Clough Fleming, present for the test, saw the risk firsthand. But the king's demand for action hung over every decision. No changes were made, no extra ballast taken on. The evidence was plain. Vasa's narrow hull and heavy upper works made her tender, quick to heel under shifting weight. Yet, instead of delay or redesign, the order was given to proceed. The warning was clear, but in the chain of command, no one stood in the way. The ship would sail, her fate sealed by the choice to ignore what the test had revealed. Vasa slipped away from the quay on August 10, 1628. Her decks were crowded with crew, officers, and guests. The wind was light, barely enough to fill the sails, but enough to move the ship slowly eastward along Stockholm's waterfront. Cannon salutes echoed across the harbor, drawing crowds to the shoreline. Families and onlookers watched as the ship, bristling with bronze guns and carved lions, glided past the royal palace. Below deck, gun crews stood by their stations, and in the hold, ballast stones sat wedged between the frames. As Vasa reached the open water near Tegelviken, a stronger gust swept down from the bluffs. The sails strained, and the ship began to heel to port. The list grew quickly, tilting the deck underfoot. Water lapped at the open lower gun ports, which had been left unshuttered for the ceremonial departure. Within seconds, the heel passed the point of recovery. The lower row of gun ports dipped below the surface, and the Baltic poured in. Crew members scrambled to close the ports, but the rush of water was too fast and too strong. On the main deck, sailors lost their footing as the angle steepened. Some clung to rigging or railings, others slid helplessly toward the low side. Below, the incoming water surged across the gun deck and into the hold, shifting the ship's weight even further off balance. The cannons, many of them unsecured after the salute, broke loose from their carriages and crashed against the walls, adding chaos to the disaster. Within minutes, Vasa rolled onto her side. The great stern castle, heavy with ornament and timber, pressed the hull deeper into the water. The ship began to sink stern first, pulling masts and rigging under. Some crew and passengers managed to scramble up the high side or leap into the water. Others, trapped below by flooding and falling debris, had no way out. The entire sequence, from the first strong gust to the moment the hull vanished, lasted 10 minutes or less. The ship covered barely 1,300 meters from her moorings before the sea claimed her. In the confusion, shouts and splintering wood mixed with the roar of water. Rescue boats rushed from shore, hauling survivors from the surface. For dozens below, escape was impossible. The Baltic closed over the most advanced warship Sweden had ever built, leaving only floating wreckage and stunned silence along the harbor's edge. Applet left Stockholm slipways just a year after Vasa, shaped by the hard lessons of its predecessor. Shipwright Hein Jacobsen had seen Vasa's instability firsthand, and he made the new hull broader, 1.2 meters wider than Vasa's beam, bringing Applet to roughly 12.5 meters across. That single change transformed the ship's stability. The superstructure, while still impressive, sat lower, and heavier elements were distributed closer to the waterline. The gun decks remained, but the arrangement of cannons changed. Fewer heavy guns were placed high up, and lighter artillery filled the upper batteries. More ballast, likely well over 120 tons, was packed deep in the hold. The lower gun ports were set higher above the water, leaving a safer margin even in rough seas. These adjustments were not theoretical. They were tested in the Baltic's unpredictable winds and waves. Applet's first major assignment came as Sweden prepared to send nearly 1,000 soldiers across the Baltic at the height of the 30 Years' War. Laden with men, guns, and supplies, the ship sailed in formation with the fleet, holding her course through open water and standing up to the same conditions that had toppled Vasa. There were no incidents of dangerous heeling, no panic as decks tilted, no sudden rush of water through gun ports. Instead, Applet performed as intended. A stable gun platform ready for action, able to deliver broadsides and carry troops safely. Her performance proved decisive. For decades, Applet served as a mainstay of the Swedish Navy. She escorted convoys, took part in Baltic campaigns, and remained afloat long after Vasa had vanished beneath the harbor. When her hull was finally worn out, she was deliberately sunk as a block ship to protect Stockholm's approaches, a quiet end for a ship built on hard-won knowledge. Her service shaped naval practice. The success of Applet's design proved that the Navy could adapt, learning from disaster and turning failure into practical progress. That wider beam and lower center of gravity became the standard for Swedish warships, setting a new course for naval architecture in the north. This was a clear measure of success. In the summer of 1956, a quiet revolution in maritime archaeology began on the chilly waters of Stockholm Harbor. Anders Fransson, a Swedish engineer and amateur historian, was convinced that the Vasa still lay somewhere beneath the silt. Decades of failed salvage attempts and shifting currents had left only rumors and scattered records, but Fransson believed the ship could be found if only the search started in the archives instead of the water. He scoured centuries-old maps, shipping logs, and insurance documents, piecing together the most likely spot where the warship had vanished. Fransson's reasoning was simple. The Baltic's brackish water, a unique mix of salt and fresh, lacked the shipworm that destroyed wooden wrecks elsewhere. If the Vasa had settled undisturbed, the hull might still be intact after more than 300 years. Armed with this theory, he built a homemade corer, a slender steel tube with a wire mesh tip, designed to plunge through mud and capture a sample of whatever lay beneath. Working from a small boat, Fransson and his team methodically probed the harbor floor, pulling up samples of black, tar-soaked oak from 32 meters down. Each core brought a new sense of anticipation, but only fragments surfaced at first. Persistence paid off, and the idea of long-term preservation drove the search onward. On August 25, 1956, a core finally brought up unmistakable evidence: thick, centuries-old oak, darkened by time and the absence of oxygen. Fransson alerted the Swedish Navy, and a team of divers prepared for a confirmation dive. The descent was slow, the water murky, but at the bottom, searchlights swept across a massive wooden hull, upright and astonishingly well-preserved. The brackish water had kept shipworms at bay, leaving the timbers, carvings, and even some of the original paint nearly untouched. For the first time since 1628, the Vasa was seen by human eyes. What had been a legend and a cautionary tale now became a tangible target, one that would soon challenge the limits of salvage engineering and lead to a dramatic confirmation of a lost past. Divers began the work by threading steel cables beneath Vasa's hull, weaving them carefully through the thick mud and silt that had protected the ship for more than 3 centuries. Each cable had to pass under the fragile timbers without splintering the wood or collapsing the decks above. The team worked in stages, laying 6 massive cables in total, spaced evenly from bow to stern. Above the surface, barges anchored in place held the ends of these cables, ready to take on the full weight of the warship. The first lift was a test of both nerves and engineering. Slowly, winches tightened, pulling the cables taut. As tension increased, the hull began to shift, rising just enough to break free from the seabed's grip. Silt and water poured out through shattered gun ports. The ship's structure groaned, but held. Over several weeks, the team repeated this process, raising the hull in increments, never more than a meter at a time. Between each lift, divers shored up weak points with wooden braces and steel bands, reinforcing the most damaged sections. Every movement brought new risks. A snapped cable, a shifting beam, or a sudden collapse could have destroyed what centuries had preserved. When the Vasa finally cleared the bottom, it floated, held upright by pontoons lashed to either side. The hull, almost 95% intact, rose from the water for the first time since 1628. The ship's carved lions, biblical kings, and sea monsters still clinging to the stern emerged into daylight. On April 24, 1961, the Vasa was towed slowly and carefully into a temporary dry dock built for her arrival. There, archaeologists and engineers began the painstaking process of recovering thousands of artifacts: cannons, tools, coins, clothing, and the personal belongings of those who had sailed and died aboard. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Each find added a new piece to the puzzle, revealing details of life aboard the most advanced warship of its age. The ship's survival and recovery became a triumph of both modern engineering and historical archaeology, restoring a lost chapter of Sweden's past to the world. Vasa's hull, preserved for centuries beneath Stockholm's harbor, stands as a monument to human ambition and to the cost of ignoring warning signs. Today, nations still chase technological leaps, often at breakneck speed. The difference between triumph and disaster remains as thin as ever. Progress demands boldness, but lasting greatness requires the courage to ask hard questions. What lessons do we risk sinking when we rush to launch? Share your thoughts below.